Are you making these history teaching mistakes? By the end of this video, you're gonna leave with a better awareness about how you can enhance your history course for better comprehension, retention, and engagement. Hello, historians, and welcome back. I'm Cecilia Tamez, and I'm an educator support specialist, and I help history teachers feel confident and competent by providing resources, support, and solutions for teaching history. Now, if you haven't subscribed already, be sure to subscribe. It's totally free to do so, and you can always change your mind later. But make sure to stay until the end of the video because I'm going to be sharing an exclusive opportunity for teachers that actually want the roadmap for implementing these improvements in their classroom. Okay, so the first mistake that I've seen history teachers make and that I've made as a history teacher is lecturing. Okay, y'all, so it's no secret that lecturing is the OG teaching method for teaching history, and I mean, rightfully so. There are some things in history that we just have to teach, but there's two ways of doing this. So there's lecturing, and this is more of where your students are literally passive recipients of information and historical processing. And then there's direct instruction. Now, direct instruction is more of you teaching, but you are teaching with the awareness that you are only trying to lay the foundation enough so that your students understand what they're about to discuss or what they're about to apply. So this means that you're not doing all the talking or all the thinking the entire period, and you're intentionally giving only enough information and cues in order to allow your students to formulate their own conclusions. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about how to shift from, plain old lecturing to intentional direct instruction, make sure you check out my video, which I'll go ahead and link down below for you to watch at the end of this video, The Lost Art of Direct Instruction. So the second mistake that I've seen teachers make when teaching history, and that I'm so guilty of myself, is handouts that align to the lecture or the visual. Now here's the deal, y'all. Sometimes I feel like we trick ourselves into believing that our students will stay focused if we give them a handout that they can use or fill in as they listen to the lecture, follow along with the video, or play along with the podcast. But here's what really happens. When you give an additional task on top of listening, something's going to get left out. And that something is the processing of the information. Your student may nail the handout, but remember absolutely nothing by the end of that assignment or the end of that lecture or video. If we are going to be leveraging graphic organizers as handouts, we must allow time for processing and discussion. This is the only way our students are actually going to retain that information. It's no secret that podcasts are all the rage these days, and that we do in fact have auditory learners. However, as a form of differentiation, when we are teaching children, we need to provide at least two sensory experiences or options that our students can use to gather information or help themselves fill in the gaps. So maybe they didn't catch something visually, but they heard it, in the audio. We need to provide that differentiation for our students. Because if we're only focusing on one sensory experience, then you're only going to be reaching your auditory learners. If I was to play a podcast in class, I would probably be showing maybe a slideshow of images on the screen to accompany the podcast, some sort of visual cue or reminder about what's going on to help summarize, in case I have students that are English language learners or special education students or just students that need the information presented in a different way. And by the way, if you do happen to have a favorite history podcast, drop it in the comments below because I actually want to add one to my playlist, but I would love to hear your recommendation. Okay, so the next mistake is not chunking the content. With all the content we have to teach in a history class, we are always racing to the finish line. And this means that sometimes in order to save time, we forget to chunk the content. Realistically speaking, our students can only absorb about 3 to 7 pieces of information every 15 minutes or so. So this means that we need to make more deliberate efforts to evaluate what we actually need to emphasize and how to break up the material so that it makes sense for students and gives them time to process. So another mistake that I've seen teachers make when teaching history is not creating central themes, even if they're teaching chronologically. Now, I can't tell you how many times with the, districts that I've worked and the teachers that I've coached, I can't tell you how many times I've heard teachers tell me things like, well, my students don't get the big idea. They're having trouble connecting, these smaller events to history as a whole, or they just can't think critically. But the truth is, what's missing in that chronological class are themes. Unless you teach a thematic course, you deliberately need to be creating themes for your course. But Cecilia, why do I need themes if I'm teaching a chronological history course? Let me take y'all back to the year 2008. But I was teaching a 7th grade Texas history class that year. My students had no clue how one historical event led to another. Basically, I hadn't supported my students in creating historical continuity because I didn't give us any central themes to reflect on. I had not created any means for my students to evaluate historical information and help themselves contextualize it. So it's important to focus on themes because that way when a student gets asked a question like, evaluate the economic effects of, blah, 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 they're able to actually make those connections. The next mistake that I've seen history teachers make and that I've made myself is avoiding teaching the challenging skills because I felt my students just couldn't do it. So the first few years of my teaching career, our learning standards changed and they just seemed so impossible, so monumental, and they created a new state test to go along with it, of course. And I was just telling myself and looking at the questions and saying, there's no way my students can do this. And of course, my mindset was the first roadblock. But the reason that I was actually so intimidated as a teacher is because I wasn't sure how I was going to get the outcome, when in reality, I should have been focusing my energy on figuring out how I would teach the process. So I know when we hear, our students need to be thinking at a higher level, I know it's really intimidating. So my advice to you is scaffold, 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 scaffold. Even if it feels like sometimes you're spoon feeding or making your learners just too dependent, they need to have the process modeled and practice until it becomes internalized. But I don't want you to feel like you're failing because you are not failing. You're modeling your thinking. However, I want to emphasize the overall focus shouldn't be on getting the outcome, teaching them to memorize the answer for this higher order thinking question. The idea is teach them the process for how you discern the answer to this question. Now, this mistake is probably like the most challenging to correct and one that could cause irreparable damage, so listen up. Teaching a chronological course and skipping around because oh my gosh, is this going to confuse your students? So as a new teacher, maybe your content knowledge is lacking. Now, I don't care if you're one day ahead of the kids, that's totally fine, perfectly normal. It won't be that way forever, but at least skim and understand what caused it, what effects it had, and know your sequence so that you can figure out how best to present the information so that it's not all over the place. So this is especially true for units where there are a lot of historical events going on, or different perspectives or thematic angles that your students are expected to understand. Because even though chronology is not the ultimate purpose of learning history, in a chronological course, it still does play an important factor, and you want students to at least have a relative idea of when a certain event took place and how things are unfolding. The next mistake that I've seen history teachers make, and that I've done myself, is teaching thematically and not giving students any anchor dates or giving them too many. I taught a chronological course and my expectation was that my students at least know 5 dates, just 5, out of a 260-year historical course. There's a myth, and clearly it's still alive and well. I'm so bad at history because I can never remember any of the dates. History is not about the when, it's about the why something happened. Now, that being said, if you are teaching a thematic history course, you want to take a good hard look at your course, the time period it spans, and give your students an intentionally curated list of dates, either by unit, which great, it's chunking. And this is especially great if you have a lot of required dates that your students are expected to just know, or maybe an overall list that they will need to know for the course. And obviously, the older the student, potentially the more dates they can keep track of. Oh my gosh. This next one, teaching in the style we're comfortable with. And this is just my observation and my experience. But when teachers are not willing to get out of their comfort zone, they don't experience any transformations. And neither do their students. You know, there was about 3 to 4 years in my teaching career where sadly, we were feeling such an immense amount of pressure because of state tests. And my inexperience made me think things like, but this is impossible. Well, what else could I be doing? Well, what responsibility will the kids have? Why is this always my fault? I'm doing the best I can. The kids can't even do basic things. They are asking for miracles. And while there was some definite truth to that, I was just defensive that I was being asked to look critically at my teaching practice and step out of my comfort zone. So when teaching, we should never whisper to ourselves, okay, let me see. How can I teach this lesson? It should be more like, let me see, what do my kids need to learn and how are they going to learn this best? So if you're skipping out of using things like visuals and music or collaborative assignments just because you think the class can't handle it, then let's reevaluate our classroom management, our SEL, how we're packaging our lessons for student consumption, what energy we're showing up with, and also what processes we're setting in place. Now, a very common mistake that I've seen history teachers make, and that I made early at the start of my career, was explaining history with history. Okay, so let me explain what I mean. If you've watched any video on this channel at all, especially my video on how students retain information, and if you're curious about watching that video, I'll go ahead and link it down below. But if you've watched any of my videos, you've heard me say this: humans learn by connecting knowns and unknowns using knowns, something that they are familiar with. If you're still trying to explain a historical event using historical jargon or historical examples, you're gonna lose the class. But as a good practice, you always want to at least provide one non-history example that your students are familiar with, that they will understand, so that it can click for them. Okay, so we don't use history examples. Now what do I use? So use feelings, cultural, musical, visual references that students can relate to. You know, oftentimes in working with teachers, I get the question, well, how do I create relevancy for my students? How do I get them to see history as important and relevant to them? And one answer to that is that non-history examples create instant relevancy. Now, earlier I promised an exclusive opportunity for teachers that wanted to have the support in implementing these changes. So if you've been feeling like you need additional support with curriculum, classroom management, or just really building up your confidence this school year, hit me up at Teach Like an Influencer down below. And let's chat about the ways that we can make this an amazing school year for you and your students. I want your success. I'm rooting for you. Until next time, class dismissed.